Okay, this is going to be an overhaul of a side pull caliper brake. Okay, this is on a Shogun Sport 1988. This is a side pull caliper brake with a single pivot in the middle. And the problem that I was having with this, and this is not at all uncommon, is that when pulling on the brake cable, the problem would be that one of the calipers would just stay stationary and only one of the other caliper would move, and it would still work, but it provides uneven pressure on the rim, and it's obviously not the way it was designed to work. Now, this brake I've already overhauled. I'm about to overhaul the front one. Okay, the front one was not as bad as the back one. I used the back one as an example. Here's what the problem was that I found on the back one as I overhauled it. So when you apply the brake cable, both of these calipers are supposed to move, and ideally they would both move by the same amount, and the gap between the pads, you know, would be completely symmetrical. Now in this case they're not symmetrical, but and one of them moves more than the other one, but it's still, you know, okay, because the brakes still work fine. But originally this one was not moving at all, and it was, you know, a bad situation because it's difficult when you do that, because you have to open up the brakes quite a bit, and then they don't grab until you're at the very end of the range of the lever there. Okay, now the way these work is there is a spring here that pushes outward on the two sides, and the spring runs through a channel in here. If this spring is very tight in the channel, then the spring on either of the two sides can be considered to be independently pushing them out. But to the extent that it's not a perfect fit through there, there's a certain amount of play or tolerance, and what can happen is, to a certain extent, the brakes are floating that way. In other words, they can both move to the right or to the left a certain amount, and they will self-center to a certain amount. Now the way this works is, this piece here to which that spring is rigidly attached is also rigidly attached to the bolt, and when you tighten this nut, that locks the position of that spring. This can be loosened and the whole mechanism can be rotated to the right or to the left in order to center it. Okay, and then you tighten it down. This one on the front has got an adjusting nut and then a lock nut. So the idea on this is, if this were too tight, neither of these two would work because there's too much compression on them. So you adjust the tension so they both work smoothly. Then you use the lock nut on the top to lock that amount of tension. Now, when these rotate, you're going to get friction between each of these washers. The washer here on the front and this caliper. Then there's a nylon washer in between. Then right in this gap here is where this particular one was having a problem. I have inserted an extra washer in there, and the reason was because the spring here, without that extra washer, was actually rubbing against this caliper, preventing this caliper from moving. It was stuck in essence. So it could be because when this spring gets rusted, it actually takes up more room physically, and the other thing is it could, over time, start to distort its shape. But in any case, I could have possibly tried bending that spring back, but what I ended up doing was adding an extra washer in there. And if you look carefully, you might actually be able to see. Let's see now if we can see that. might actually be able to see the two washers if it focuses properly in this gap, but you may not be able to see that because the focus may not be good enough. But anyway, I increased the width of this gap enough so that this spring was not rubbing against that, and now I have both of the arms moving. Okay, it's not perfect, but it's okay. Now on the other side, on the front one, we have a similar situation here, in the sense that one of them is moving more than the other one, and it's this one which always seems not to move as much. But on this case, it actually is moving a little bit, and this brake actually is not so bad. I noticed that it doesn't have that same problem with that caliper rubbing against that spring like it did on the other one. But still, the lubrication at this spot in between here, there's probably more friction in that location than there is at the other location. So the front one, this one here, the caliper in the front seems to slide more easily than the back one. So what I'll do is I'll disassemble this, I'll clean all this, then I'll add some lubrication in there, just to give this an overhaul, and then I'll readjust the brakes. So first I will disassemble. Okay, I'm going to be using this Glenn's Complete Bicycle Manual. This is an old book now, but this is an old bike. These side pull brakes follow this exploded view, this type. This book has two different types. This one is most closely, this says Schwinn approved, Wyman and Altenberger, and it looks almost identical to what I'm looking at on this bike, although there are some variations in the components. Okay, so the first step, remove the caliper assembly. First we're going to remove this cable to free up the caliper. Okay, I removed the cable from here. I would have to say that it almost doesn't matter the exact order in which you disassemble these components. You do want to make sure that you don't lose track of the order, so taking some pictures is a good idea. Next, I'm going to remove this nut here, pull the assembly out, and then basically these components will come apart. Okay, I took off the nut on here, and what I ended up with is a lock nut, which is the kind that has that plastic locking portion, a washer, another thick washer, then there's this washer which is maybe called a radius. It's got the curved cross section. Okay, and I always like to put these back in the exact order that I took them off, but after cleaning these, you'll notice that it's not always possible to tell which side. For example, this nut looks perfectly symmetrical, and you can't always. Here I can tell the order that they were based on the pattern that's showing up on it. I can tell which side went to which side. You can't always tell that. Not that it will necessarily matter, but I just like not to take any chances and put it back the same way it was. So I try to keep track of that, and you know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I look at it carefully when you take it apart. Having a picture of it helps. Going back through this, for example, will help. If I did put it together wrong, I could always take it apart later and try to put it back together the other way. Okay, now I'm basically just going to slide this caliper out. Okay, there's another washer with a curved portion here. There's the reflector. Then there's this assembly, which I will now remove this nuts and take these components off. And I will also take these brakes off, the brake pads. Okay, I took these two nuts off here. This seems to be a little bit frozen on. I'm going to remove this spring, I think just by doing that with my fingers. I can take that off. That comes out. Well, I'll have to pull on these components to separate them, and then I'll be able to get that off. Okay, I started trying pulling all this apart. It wouldn't come apart so easy, so I actually just started unthreading the bolt. Now, this is not threaded, but nevertheless, when it's a tight friction, when you unthread it, it still will allow it to come out. When pulling on it, won't allow it to come out very easily. So all these components now will come apart. Okay, I have them all apart. I've laid them out in the order that I took them off. I'm going to remove these because I want to clean these off and I don't want to get solvent on the brake pads. Okay, all the components are off, and now I will just wipe them off clean, and then I'll put them in a basket of solvent. Okay, I put all of the parts that relate to the pivoting movement. This is a plastic washer, so I'm not putting that in the solvent. And the other stuff doesn't really need to be cleaned with the solvent. I'll just brush off, you know, because it's not a moving part. These parts I want just to, you know, to clean it. I could also clean these with a Q-tip, but I'm just going to do this for now. Okay, I cleaned these two parts off with a Q-tip. I didn't want to put them in the solvent because I wasn't sure how it would react. I put some solvent on a Q-tip. This one was painted. I didn't want that to come off in the solvent. So I just cleaned the back of it with a Q-tip and solvent. And now I'll take the parts out of the solvent, I'll wipe them dry, and I'll just start putting it back together. Okay, I wiped them all off, and I did end up using a Q-tip with solvent on those areas that relate to the pivoting action, and also in there. And I also have like a little brush. The solvent probably, dipping them in the solvent probably was not important because they were only in there for a short period of time anyway, and it doesn't really remove everything. The Q-tip works better. Okay, I'm going to start to assemble this now. Okay, I put the central pieces back together. I did not put any lubrication in here. The Glenn book never mentions putting any lubrication in here whatsoever, and the Sheldon Brown website does say that the pivots should be lubricated. Now, I can always add a little bit of lubrication to this as needed once I have it in. I was kind of curious to see how well it would work even without the lubrication. Exactly what type of lubrication to use is probably the Tri-Flow, something very light. You know, the problem is, of course, it does get wet. You want to keep the water out, but it's really impossible. Okay, now I'll put the rest back too. Okay, I put the brake pads back on. Not in their final position, but just to get the assembly back together. Okay, now I just put the assembly through here. And now I'll just add these bolts to the back, nuts and bolts. Okay, I tightened the bolt under there. I just centered this by hand. The calipers are wide open. I just centered it and tightened the bolt. Now I can always adjust that later to rotate the calipers. And the adjusting nut in the front, of course, I can always adjust that too, according to the tension. I want them to move smoothly after I lubricate them. Okay, now I'm going to add the cable back. Okay, I'll place the cable back through. Now I'm going to clamp the cable in through that lock to that lock nut. Okay, I attach the cable into the that lock nut. Now it just needs some adjusting. You can kind of see that when I apply the brakes. Both of the calipers are moving. One of them definitely moves more than the other one. What I'll probably do is apply a little lubrication. Now you'll notice that, you might have noticed that plastic washer actually has a split in it. I didn't have a replacement for that, so I just went ahead and reassembled it. I think it's going to be fine. I think I'll put a little bit of lubrication here. Then I will try centering these by possibly loosening this and rotating the whole assembly and then locking it down. Then I will lock, if I'm satisfied with the amount of play that I have here, then I'll lock the lock nut with that nut, then I'll make an adjustment on the cable. Okay, I put some silicone spray in this area. I more or less tried centering the calipers, and then I tightened that nut. Now you'll notice there's still play in the calipers. In other words, as a pair, you can swing them back and forth. They both go together because that spring has some play inside. It's not locked, you know, rigidly. It moves a little bit. So this whole thing is a little bit free floating, and that should be fine. Now I'm just going to tighten the tension to bring these into more clearance to get it, because right now they're all the way out. Okay. Okay, I have made an adjustment. I did make another adjustment on this positioning. I pulled them together, loosened that, and pulled this down a little bit more because I didn't have as much range. And now I have just adjusted this one out so that it has what I consider to be a reasonable amount of clearance, and when I spin the wheel, it gives me, you know, a good bite. It bites into them before, you know, you get all the way compressed. So I think this is going to be fine. With a test drive, then I can make a more precise adjustment on this because it's in the mid-range, which is good. Now I'm just going to lock this screw here, which is the 10mm. I'll just lock that down, and then this is good to go. Okay, I forgot to mention I do need to lock the front bolt, so I need to hold this one, then use a second wrench to lock that. I hadn't shown that. Okay, so this is all locked down now. I do notice that on the front one that I'm still getting, you know, more motion on one caliper than the other, and also more than what I'm getting on the back. On the back, I get a more balanced amount of motion on the two calipers, and I think it's because the first caliper, I think, just has more friction on that first connection, and if I put an extra washer in there, or a new washer, that might make that one smoother, and then it might move more. But the thing is, it still works fine because once they bite, they will both close on the wheel. Okay, so I don't think this is really a major problem at all. And that's all for this.